A year and a half ago now or so, Nikolai talked about this starting to take shape, and I'm thrilled that it's here on this campus, and it's actually happening. I'm thrilled to be on this panel today with three people whose work I admire quite a bit, people I've known in different capacities over the years in different spaces, and so it's personally really great to be here with all of you. You've got bios and titles in the program. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to dispense with the long intros and CV performances and kind of dive right in. I thought what we might do, I have a list of questions and topics that I'm personally interested in and that I hope are of interest to the group. But I thought what we might do first, have each panelist just in about 5 minutes or so, just kind of lay out what they think are some of the key, based on their research and work, both in the past and work that they're doing now, lay out some of the key topics and debates and issues that are that they're wrestling with in facing the contemporary landscape around so many of the issues that are being talked about across the panels today, if that's okay with everybody. And maybe we'll start on the opposite end of the work this way. Todd, is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. So I have the privilege of being up here with two colleagues that I've learned so much from. So really what I feel like I'm going to say is just a footnote to the work that they've done, and I've learned so much. You start with algorithms. I mean, we might think about defining this term, and it's notoriously difficult to define, but certainly a kind of set of mathematical instructions usually executed by computers to do something. And it's composed usually of perhaps a what, let's say what's to be done through abstraction, definition of variables and things. And I imagine a kind of how, which is the procedures to be followed in order to do that. How the data is going to be generated, structured, processed, stored, things like that. The question of why is really not part of that. It probably should be. And it's important, I think, to ask these questions that begin to raise, when we have ethical questions are always about should or ought. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But those are usually not within the logic or the control of an algorithm, at least ostensibly. I think it's also important to point out that algorithms, and this may be just completely obvious, but in terms of genre, they're not narratives, and they're not stories, and they're not voices, and they're not bodies. And in that regard, they're not ambiguous or uncertain or fallible in quite the same way. And when they do make sense of history, they tend to do so in an instrumentalized way, which means you gather the data about some set of circumstances in order to do something with it, like predict future behavior, criminality, policing. And what happens is a massive reduction of complexity, since the number of variables being analyzed is by definition limited. And I think there's where the ethical questions immediately come up, and we enter into the field which Safiya and Ramesh are among the two most foremost practitioners of, critical algorithm studies. I've read Algorithms of Oppression and not only been inspired by this work, but also realized that in order for us to begin to raise these ethical questions, we have to look at the ways in which algorithms reinscribe racial, gender, sexuality, gender biases, hierarchical biases, exclusionary forms. And this is also echoed in Ramesh's work, which is also a kind of a form of countermapping, a kind of an imagination of alternatives, particularly focused on values around diversity, inclusivity, and democracy. And that seems to me, if we're going to link ethics and algorithms together, we have to ask those kind of questions. I mean, the privilege of unethical algorithms, I mean, we can go into this in great detail, but sentencing by algorithm, criminality by algorithm, massive inscrutable algorithms, unchecked data harvesting, all of these kind of things have come up already, and I think that we need to confront them. Let me just end by maybe just raising some questions about where the tradition of, could be a philosophical tradition of ethics could come in around accountability. And of course, if you think about accountability, we have to ask to whom and how, right? And even if we go back to the kind of, sort of grandfathers, so to speak, of ethical traditions, like someone like Kant, and look at the critique of practical reason, this is really a critique about action, agency, and how I ought to be or should act. And what that means is can I act in such a way that my actions are rendered into a universal law or maxim? If that's the case, then I can't be treating others as a means to an end, but I have to treat them as an end in themselves. So can an algorithm treat others as an end in themselves? Can algorithms help us ask these questions about ought? These are, I think, are open, interesting questions. To me, and maybe I'll just put this on the table, perhaps some of the elements of an ethical algorithm would be computation that humanizes or returns humanity to those who are dehumanized. And so this is a form of thinking about, say, databases or algorithmic processes, not in order to use someone or something for another end, like to collect more data to make more money. That would be using as a means to an end, but rather to humanize. And that means to return complexity and agency and diversity and the values of difference. That would be a kind of thing. Okay, I'm glad someone agrees with that. The other thing I want to say in my last few points is that we have to think about the question of agency. Earlier, Lucian Floridi defined agency as capacity to do something, but I think it's slightly more complex than that. It's a capacity to decide whether to do something. If you don't act, as an algorithm, you run it, it acts. A drone will go and shoot somebody. At no point, unless a human intervenes, will the drone not do that. And so if you ascribe agency to the drone has to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do that. The drone doesn't do that. And so I think agency has to be decided as a capacity to decide whether to do X. And that's where you're in the realm of should. And that also means you're in the realm of responsibility. So I'll end with that. Those are some of my thoughts initially. But like I said, this is just the footnote to Safiya and Ramesh's book.
I love Todd. And I feel like you just covered my book, so I'm going to say something else. And I really appreciate your kind of launching us into this conversation about ethics, because I think ethics is really kind of the key buzzword that's happening right now around algorithms and artificial intelligence. Certainly my work is concerned with rethinking maybe beyond just ethics into these other kinds of moral questions. And it's interesting to me that this conference is called Morals and Machines and not Ethics and Machines, because ethics has been a way of, I think, in some ways, obscuring the morality or immorality, if you will, of the kinds of systemic engagements that we're having with digital technologies and artificial intelligence. I would argue ethics as a framework is just too narrow, because it really ascribes the agency to the individuals. How do I use algorithms? How am I impacted by algorithms? Rather than thinking about the social structures that over-determine what AI and algorithms will do, which far eclipse anything we can do as individuals. And so, if I were to think of kind of other corollaries where we think about where discrimination or immorality or morals are taken up, they're in the realm of social justice, let's say. And we've got new words to obscure thinking about social justice, like words like diversity, words like inclusion, words like equity, that also help reframe the issues to agency of the individual, how I behave, how I act in relationship to others, which again is not necessarily the only register within which we can think about these types of actions. The question is really, how do social structures, social systems of oppression, which is one of the reasons why in my work I use words like oppression rather than diversity, because oppression helps us, I think, reframe the structural dimensions, whether it's capitalism, racialized gendered capitalism, that are the contexts within which algorithms and AI get deployed and work in service of or not. And so I think this is one of the ways that I would just offer a provocation for us today when we think about the morality of algorithms and AI. The other thing I would say is and one of the previous speakers said this as well, Andrew, that centering the vulnerable is one of the ways that we can think morally about the systems that we're engaging with. And I think this is a place where often people who are most likely to be impacted negatively by AI and algorithms have no say whatsoever. In my work, I characterize these communities as the data disposable. They're the people upon which algorithms and AI are experimented. And you see this in universal credit, social credit, other emerging kind of systems of foreclosing opportunities, criminal sentencing. There's a whole host of cashless bail, ways that we can look at predictive analytics and predictive technologies that don't necessarily work in service of those who are most vulnerable. So I think the last thing I will say is kind of just an opening remark is that we have whole new fields of study that are coming online. Most recently, I think the ACM FAT, which is a horrific acronym. I know they're changing the name, but you know, the fairness, accountability, transparency, and I know they try to fix that by adding E and making it FATE, E for ethics. You know, this is an interesting movement, again, because I think there's so much of a kind of focus on perfecting algorithms, taking bias, for example, out of algorithms, making algorithms or AI more transparent. If only we could see the code. These kinds of logics. And again, I think these really are narrow conceptions of how we might think about the directions in which AI is moving to over-determine outcomes for people's lives. What we see, in fact, is that algorithms and AI are increasingly used to foreclose opportunity rather than open opportunity. And I think that to me, this is, again, a more, no matter what we want to say about the law, you know, combating the possibilities of AI, that will only be for a very narrow margin of the society. And more people, I think, are likely to fall victim to just having some opportunities never be shown to them or made available or being profiled into certain kinds of data profiles. I once heard don't ask me why I was in the same room with the director of the FBI. It was a weird conference. But I will say that he said...
Why were you in...
I don't know is the answer. And he said, you know, in the eyes of the state, our data profiles are who we are. So that was the position of the United States government official who was at this conference. And so I think, you know, that really raises a whole host of other kinds of moral questions about who are we as data subjects, how will we ever know, and how can we intervene upon those kinds of profiles as well.
Hi everybody, thank you for having me, and it's great to share the stage with my colleagues here, all of whom I respect a great deal. So I was in a former life trained as an AI and machine learning developer, and I worked in that space for 2 years, and it was, you know, an interest in kind of moving past some of the limitations of that space that led me in my graduate work to start to think about developing and designing technologies with and for different communities, particularly communities that are systemically marginalized across the world. And while I was a graduate student at MIT, I had an opportunity to take a course with Marvin Minsky, who's well known as sort of a founding figure of AI. And I remember in that class describing to Professor Minsky, rest in peace, my interests in, you know, kind of community technology and community media and so on. And his response was, you know, you can learn anything you want. He said it glibly, but you can learn anything you want about the communities you might want to work with simply by going to Las Vegas. So I don't mean to demean Professor Minsky, and I know he was being glib in his response to me, but there's something being said here, which is the real question of power and justice and governance over the technologies that have increasingly, much more so than when I was a graduate student, come to order our world, right? We've seen a qualitative shift in the importance of AI, which was sort of laughed at back when I was an AI developer, because of the amounts of data that we are somewhat willfully releasing on our devices 24/7, and the ways those forms of data, as Safiya just said, are being constructed to form identities and treat us as predictive subjects for all forms of power and surveillance imaginable. I got to know firsthand while I was an engineer, especially in relation to experiences like that, how when I created software code and so-called learning technologies or machine learning technologies, what I was actually creating was a reflection of myself, my own so-called biases, right? These are the values that drive the design of so-called neutral technologies that are so important to actually shifting and ordering the results that those technologies actually put out. I also got to be exposed to the how subjective the data sets I chose to have my technologies learn from actually work, right? Because we're thinking not only about the design and development of learning systems through software architectures of various forms, but also the data sets that they're being trained upon, so to speak, and how absent both those steps were from the people who the technologies I was creating, and I wasn't very important, whose lives would actually be impacted, the foreclosure of opportunities and possibilities at that time. So right now we're at a very, very important moment, a very important inflection point, because these sorts of learning systems are not just learning technologies or AI technologies, they are increasingly coming to order everything that we know of in our world because of their invisibility and their embeddedness. This is a real key point. My colleagues alluded to it. Digital systems and AI systems and specialized AI systems and machine learning systems are embedded within other types of technologies in ways over which we have no understanding, visibility, or that lack any forms of real transparency. Think about smart cities, Internet of Things. These things are just taking off 5G networks, right? But also think about their embeddedness in institutions that we treat as neutral, or many people treat as neutral, though we know that's not the case. Our criminal justice system, our policing systems, and so on, right? These are forms of embeddedness that are absent public audit, particularly the voices of those most disproportionately targeted and harmed by the nature of these systems themselves, which all the time tends to be people on the margins of economic, racial, and global power and voice. And so when we think about these issues, my work tends to be very global in its scope. We're actually not just talking about people of color and communities on the margins in our country, but actually global populations. I had an opportunity for my new book that's going to be coming out in October called Beyond the Valley to actually intervene and kind of talk with folks running the Google AI lab in the continent of Africa in Accra. And I had a chance to ask them, like, how are you constructing AI? How are you thinking about AI? And it's incredible how this so-called ordering of the world that AI is supposed to represent is actually very much owned by private corporate interests. And this is really what's dominating and shaping this world as we know it. So I'll just kind of end by making the point that my colleagues made, that we're often presented with a false choice when it comes to AI technologies. Either accept AI technologies in some sort of sense as morally neutral or ethical, if you will, in a kind of sanitized sense, or accept prejudice, bias, and overt human-based discrimination. And that is really a false choice, right? Because the choice should be, what are the values of humanism by which we're guided by? What are the values of those who are always excluded by systems of technocratic and scientific capitalist power? And how can those values guide the technologies of today and tomorrow? To say that a racist judge is not, is even worse than a racist algorithm is not the right choice. The question should be, what kinds of systems should we be introducing into the world, and who are the communities and stakeholders that we must support right here and now to actually guide, own, govern, and audit those kinds of systems. So I'll just kind of take it with that.
Thank you all. So for me, one of the important markers when a concept in culture or a form of cultural expression reaches a tipping point mainstreamness from which there is no return is when it enters into the content of advertising. And I think about this specifically in my own work with the moment that I realized that hip-hop culture, and I'm old enough to remember this moment, was something that that had fully entered mainstream commercial culture in a profound way, and that was when Cal Worthington of Worthington Ford sang a Snoop Dogg song in an advertisement just after Snoop's first record came out. And that seemed to be a really interesting moment about what had happened to hip-hop, that had become so centered that it was now able to be used and in a way mocked in an advertisement. Last year, of course, was the year that I would say algorithms hit that mark with advertising, which is the Burger King commercials, which is the first advertising campaign to use algorithms in the ad. So they had the algorithmic voice trying to sell chicken fingers or whatever Burger King calls them. And Carl's Jr. has now countered that ad. The other day, it's not like I knew this history, I had to research this. I'm not tracking algorithmic advertising. But Carl's Jr. had an ad poking fun at the Burger King ad where someone calls in the ad and says, makes a joke about the so-called algorithm man. They say, who's the algorithm man? Who's the man who does the algorithm voice? And it was, of course, meant as a joke about the Burger King ad, but it raised a really, kind of accidentally raised an interesting point in my head, which was unmasking the algorithm as belonging to someone, as if there was an algorithm man, right? A Wizard of Oz who is behind the embedded, invisible, non-agentic systems that we accept as the norm and neutral. So I wanted to maybe ask each of you to kind of riff on that a little bit, which is, because all of you are mapping the problems. And it sounds like in the earlier sessions, which I unfortunately missed this morning, there were a lot of mapping of the problems, right? So what are some of the ways to first do some of that unmasking of the human agency embedded within the embeddedness of algorithms? And I know, this is a large part, of course, of what your book's about, but I don't know, if you could each talk about the role of the human, or this idea of the algorithm man, which I really like as a figure to play with and unpack some of these things. I don't know if you can go in any order that you want to chime in.
Sure, I'll jump in quickly. It reminds me of our former panelist, Sarah Roberts, who I collaborate with quite a bit. She was working on a paper and we were at a conference and she said, your algorithm is a human. And I think this is one of the things that we also forget, is that a lot of these processes we think about as being fully automated, but in fact they include a lot of human agency, not just in the software engineers who write them, which I think is kind of, again, a place where we focus a lot of attention, as if we could, in fact, engineer out bias out of human beings. We didn't need a machine to help us figure out that, harboring racism and sexism and homophobic attitudes was not so good. It's kind of the interesting idea that somehow machines will help us somehow tackle the questions and dilemmas of our humanity that we've had, at least since the kind of advent of the modern capitalist age. So I think there's certainly agency that's happening there, but of course, in our field in information studies, we look at things like the social construction of data, that even the making of representative data is really important to understand. And that representation, of course, for anybody in cultural studies, we know that representation is also not a perfect encapsulation of the human experience either. So now we start to have many layers of whether it's representation or the kind of like data sets that flatten the human experience, but then somehow are standing as a proxy for our humanity. I find it interesting that, and I say this, as well in my work, that at the very moment where we have the possibility of democratic, kind of multiracial, multigendered, democratic leadership and participation in the United States in the late 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the emergence of affirmative action, all kinds of efforts to try to remedy systemic discrimination, that is also the moment that gives rise to a belief in computing and computing power as making better decisions than human beings, and sequestering the decision-making power back to a really small subset of the population. So there are many layers, I think, that we can look at who the algorithm man is, ultimately, which is, many men, quite frankly. And, I think that this is probably, one of the most dangerous dimensions of thinking about ethics and algorithms, which is that somehow these flat systems, even if they are complex, these flat representations, and of course there are many people who are doing excellent work, even challenging statistics and the origin story of the philosophies of math and the racialized politics of those. So I think we have to think about these kinds of layered histories and try to bring out those dimensions rather than reducing the algorithm to a simple technology or the formula.
Yeah, some mechanisms by which we can start to unpack all this can go through the life cycle of how algorithms are applied and within what they're embedded. We can start by understanding what are the data and digital footprints, so to speak, that are being collected about us by whom, for what purposes. We can try to understand how that data are being retained for how long. We can also try to understand how those forms of data might be aggregated with other forms of data, right? Like, give me a break, who I am on Facebook is really not who I am, at least in any complete sense, but what happens when that data gets cross-referenced with my credit card records? That's sort of one stream, right? Like all these sorts of practices of extraction and collection and monetization that are associated with the human. I think a second point here is trying to really unpack the values to which, if you will, that algorithm is applied, is designed, but also optimized for, right? It's quite clear that a lot of the algorithms that populate our social media experiences are optimized, obviously in self-serving ways, but more explicitly to keep and maintain our attention, And so one thing that gets people's attention are car crashes, or the equivalent of that in terms of recommended content on Facebook or YouTube or any of them, I mean, you can really see it. I think that it's extremely important, and this is like really what I was trying to highlight earlier, to take every sort of techno-social practice and really unpack who are the stakeholders, who are the communities that are implicated by those processes and those practices, right? So who are the communities that are targeted through a redlining algorithm, for example? Who are the communities globally, and that's why I alluded to the African continent earlier, that are targeted by the new actions taken to co-opt and include the fastest growing continent of people in the world, the fastest growing internet accessibility in the world on the African continent. Who is being co-opted and extracted and collected, and are those people, and what kinds of people are being involved in that process with what types of effects, right? And so really, for me, it's like every single step of the deployment, the collection, the monetization has to be made open, and it all has to be, the governance of all of this has to be unpacked and decentralized.
Thanks. And just to add, just briefly, I would connect the conversation we're having around quote-unquote algorithm man back to the conversation we had in the last panel around the mechanical Turk. And not only in its instantiation in the 18th century as both a form of infatuation, but particularly as it's hiding the labor, right? Of hiding, and the work of unmasking that has to happen. Well, in the case of the 18th century incarnation, you unmask the labor and there's a single person there. In the case of the 21st century Amazon Mechanical Turk, you unmask it and it's a radically atomized, distributed group of people who often, probably do not know about the existence of other people. And so what this causes is and we ended the last panel talking about this, I think Sarah raised this question, which is it makes possibilities for organizing and resistance and solidarity particularly challenging. So how do we need to rethink or kind of, I would love to have this conversation, I mean, how do we reimagine organizing around, in a world in which Amazon's Mechanical Turk is a form of radical atomization and distribution, inequitable distribution of labor. what kind of forms of solidarity and meaning-making and resistance are possible in that worldview. And I think of Hannah Arendt in this regard, because she talked in the 1950s, following on her analysis of totalitarianism, that modernity was about atomization, as a term that she used at that time. Isolated, lonely, separate, very much cut off from one another. And imagined, a response that had to be would be to create modes of solidarity for building resistance. But the problem, which I think, again, she made me think the idea of Safiya's concept of data disposables is very much connected to what Arendt identifies as superfluous human material. Superfluous human material is that which doesn't have any agency, which is disposable, which is essentially not, doesn't get to even count as human. And my fear is that, when you think about algorithm man, it's really, we need to think about the labor that's behind Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is precisely about keeping people, keeping them far apart.
And making sure that those quote-unquote people are always possible to be disposed of. Right? To have that built-in precarity that is built, as we all know, especially in the context of the United States, within a very concrete history of building democracy in the name of the disposability of massive populations of people. Right? That's built the capitalist economy, that's built the so-called democratic structures of this country. That all of these conversations, while new and contemporary, are embedded with these much larger histories. So, on that note, and Todd, you took us back to the 50s, and I want to stay there for a second. Santiago Alvarez, a prominent Cuban filmmaker during the Cuban Revolution, who pioneered the work of montage films and documentary films in Latin America, toward the aim of a kind of revolutionary aesthetic in Cuba and beyond. Once said that the reason he used montage, which he identified as a specifically European practice, as a European system, as part of his revolutionary aims as a filmmaker, was that he realized, quote, how indispensable the search for new informational forms now become for the revolution, for the Cuban Revolution. And so I want to then maybe put that to each of you, which is, we are all very good at identifying these problems, right? So, but now, how can we, is there a way to talk about algorithmic technologies and algorithmic practices as part of an indispensable search for new informational forms, i.e. how can the algorithm be used, like montage, let's say, can it be flipped or inverted to become a technology of opposition or a technology of revolutionary practice? How do we begin that conversation in practical terms?
Well, for me, there's no inherent issue that I have with algorithms in and of themselves, and I just think it's important because I think sometimes today we're using the term algorithm indispensably with the boogeyman. An algorithm is just a repeated set of computational procedures that don't even have to be computational, mathematical procedures that are acted upon some body of data. I think we can. There are examples of possibly using algorithmic systems to expose corruption, to expose abuse, to visualize various forms of inequity and injustice. I think there are also likely, we have to kind of think on a human first level, a humanized level, a humanistic level about what those questions are, but there are examples of sort of, if you will, deterministic themes where you can apply a fairly straightforward mathematical procedure to just answer that question. There are questions to which most human beings, including those who are left powerless by most technological systems, might agree to, in terms of that question, right? Like, there might be some sort of efficiency-specific kinds of themes that you can apply algorithmic systems to. That said, I think the way this whole system of power around algorithmic systems, algorithmic technologies shifts and inverts is by doing all we can to expose and make transparent the abuses and unmask all of it. Unmask who's profiting off of it, who is monetizing it, and how it's potentially being abused.
I'm less optimistic, which is why I didn't want to go first. I think okay, the first thing we have to do is we can't get reductionist about what algorithms are and just call them math and then say it's math. Because the point is that algorithms are actually working in a social and cultural power context. So it's not helpful. It's kind of like saying, well, reducing money to the paper it's printed on, but not talking about money as an instrument of capital. So I think it's really important that we understand algorithms as instruments of capital. And in that respect, then it's like, I guess the question is, can we re-engineer capitalism to liberate us? Probably most of us in this room know the answer to that already. So I think these are the kinds of concerns that I take up, and which provoke us maybe a little bit around to say, are we asking the right questions? Are we just focusing too narrowly again on the mathematical formulations and their end results? Or are we thinking about how they are again restructuring society with the more efficient distribution of opportunity, resources, extracting more, certainly in terms of labor, and redistributing resources. And let me give you an example. We already know that AI is going to radically transform the kind of global labor economies. All the studies are out, we know. And we also know that the studies are showing us, in UK House of Commons, for example, last spring, predicted that by 2030, the top 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. And I often say, I was telling this to my friend who just turned 30, and I said, what do they think? We're going to watch videos of other people eating food? And she was like, yeah, girl, I do that. And I was like, see, that's not it. But these are the kinds of questions, I think, that we have to think about algorithms and AI in that kind of context, so that we don't get so reduced. And my friend, my colleague, Greg Laser is here from the Department of Information Studies at UCLA, and he and I often talk about C. Wright Mills. And one of the things that I think is really valuable about looking again at Mills is that Mills, provokes us to think about our seemingly private troubles, our private concerns, and how the lack of this atomization, right, keeps us from understanding these as kind of collective public concerns about the values upon which our societies are organized. We have, I think, new paradigms that we should be rethinking. And, a lot of times I think we are in these conversations and we think that it's just, we feel like it's totalizing. These new technologies, they're here, we can't call them back, it's a fait accompli. But I would remind you, because I am plenty old enough to remember when big tobacco was the name of the game. In fact, tobacco, cotton, sugar were the organizing logics of the US economy and Caribbean economies and into South America. And no one could imagine that we could reorganize our societies off of an enslaved labor force. And yet, we are attempting still to do that. So I think there's something about thinking around what does it mean that we feel that this kind of new technologies are totalizing. And in the case of big tobacco, some of us in this room are old enough to remember when 4 out of 5 doctors recommended Marlboro or Camel cigarettes. When a lot of research held up that industry, bogus research, a lot of people also remember watching people organize and take on big tobacco. And I think in my own work, I feel like organizing and taking on big tech is just as noble a cause to think about a radical reimagining rather than getting fixated on just the simple algorithm.
Well, the question around what a revolutionary aesthetic might look like is a really, is one that I think we'll have to turn to artists and humanists and authors to help us imagine, and not one that I, as a critic, can be able to formulate. But certainly, I think your question is what will these new informational forms look like that are able to be responsive in helping us to imagine new forms of community and sociality? These are certainly urgent questions, and I think you're right, Josh, to push us to that point where we're thinking about that stage. At this point, I think we're kind of in that. I think that I'm haunted often by the Audre Lorde's question. Can the master's tools dismantle the master's house in a sense. Can you use algorithms to kind of unmask algorithms? And I think, yes, we can. And I think we see interesting forms of maybe like counter speech or counter mapping, where I think, projects that I work on, which I happen to do a lot with GIS, we know that GIS is embedded to a military historical framework, to Cartesian kind of worldviews, to Western epistemologies. And we also can use both that information system and that aesthetic in order to unmask how it works, to show its historicity, to show it's implicated not only, say, in redlining, but also it can produce other forms of, say, counter mapping, like, say, indigenous mapping projects that are happening here at UCLA by colleagues of mine, or work of Kelly Lytle Hernandez called $1 Million Hoods, where she's using those very mapping technologies and data from the LAPD in order to show, one, how that data is structured, two, how it's being used on massive scales to incarcerate large numbers of communities of color, but also how it's so disproportionate to the investments in educational infrastructure. And so, yes, you're using those very GIS technologies, but you're doing so in a way that's exposing. And so I think it's asking that, I think, critical Audrey-Lewis question about using those tools, dismantling those tools, but there's still that third prong, which is, a radically new revolutionary aesthetic. And I think, I hold out for, artists and folks in literature to help us to see differently.
My worry is that all the artists are going to end up working in big tech. They already are, right? I mean, this is part of the poll, right? So let me maybe switch gears just a little. Well, actually, before I switch gears quickly, because I know we're going to turn to Q&A as well, I'm just wondering, in the spirit of those examples, which are super helpful, and Kelly's project, I think, is a really great one to underline and highlight. I'm just wondering if either of you also, if there's other concrete projects or kind of disruption, I'm not going to use that word, eruptions that you can point to of where, if we're talking, Safiya, you mentioned, you used the phrase, I think, data activism, right? Like, where can we locate that? Or just a couple of things or one or two that you could each point to? Sure.
I mean, I can go. Okay, that's been really the body of my work over the last, 20 years. As I mentioned, I've done kind of community technology-oriented work, largely partnered, working with the spirit of praxis, with different communities in different parts of the world, with indigenous and native communities. I've been writing quite a bit about DIY, collectively owned digital networks and infrastructures, for example, in the region of Oaxaca, which is the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world, owned and created and designed and monetized by Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mihi communities. I've also done some work in Chiapas in a very similar thread with mesh networks connected to the Zapatista movement. And I had written for about 3 years, between 2011 and 2013, about the incredible people-based manners, people-based ways by which Egyptian and Arab Spring activists had figured out ways to rewire technologies, rewire the online and offline, create new choreographies of protest and activism, and I've written quite a bit about that also for the progressive and, to a lesser extent, the mainstream media. And this is why I'm saying I agree with what Safiya said, that algorithms aren't totalizing, if I'm quoting it correctly. That's why I also believe that algorithms should not be totalizing in a way where they are inherently seen as instruments of oppression and surveillance. That said, I do agree with you that simply saying it's mathematical and natural and neutral is problematic. But I do believe in the potential of counter mapping, of counter movements, of collaboration. It's really all about, for me, questions of governance, voice, and power. And that's why, as much as possible, we need to democratize and expose the abuses involving algorithmic systems.
Yeah, I would just say in the US, it's been, there have been a lot of, quite frankly, women of color and LGBTQ scholars who have done a lot of pushing around these questions of power and algorithms and AI, although weirdly, where many of us are kind of erased from those conversations. Many of us have taken a lot of body blows, let's just say, for a decade in trying to get these conversations into the mainstream. I'm always amazed at a document like this when Here we're talking about the inherent values and morality and immorality embedded in computing systems when, close to a decade ago when I was writing a dissertation about algorithmic discrimination, it was hard to find 4 people who would put their names on the line and say, yeah, well, we think that is happening. So, we've come a long way in terms of new assumptions that we have now that we take for granted, and I think it's been people who have both, our own identities are in the margin, journalists, scholars who have done the activism, quite frankly, in terms of the critique. There's certainly people who are also doing a lot of important work around public policy and interventions in those places, and again, I see a tremendous number of women of color at the forefront of that work too here in the U.S.
So last question, and then this will be a quick one, I think, and then we'll open it up. Is literally an academic one, which is, so I'm in a communications school where for the first time, I've been there for 14 years, and for the first time in that 14 years, I would say it's really only been in the last year, maybe 2 years, where almost every single conversation internally in our school ends up talking about data. We need to hire in data. We need to have more classes in data. We need to do more with AI. We need to do more with computer science. And it's taken over the conversation within our field, which makes a lot of very good sense in terms of the centrality of these themes, as we've been talking about it. But it also worries me quite a bit that in a way we give in to this as the new norm, and therefore it thoroughly changes the way we do our work. And I'm just wondering if any of you have any quick comments about how to think about this within a university system, within a disciplinary or academic system, about what are best practices for approaching some of these topics?
Well, part of this is this flat-out scarcity of resources in higher ed in particular, where NSF is not lining up to fund Black feminist critique of technology, I promise you. But they are interested in funding people who can either incorporate the hot keywords into their research. And so part of it is just that people need to survive in these institutions that have not ironically been defunded by the same sector that we're talking about. So here you have the largest sector in terms of big technology that doesn't pay taxes, quite frankly. And that is a huge source of revenue to fund higher education, public libraries, public media. And so you have a sector that literally depletes the resources out of our systems that we're working in, and then forces us to go back to these kinds of paradigms in order to legitimate ourselves with any kinds of public resources. So I think that's one of the kinds of challenges that a lot of scholars are facing. And this is where, I've been in the rooms where, with my colleagues from Digital Humanities, not here at UCLA, but at the University of Illinois, where all the digital, all the humanists are trying to figure out how to become digital so that they can help their departments survive. Right, and again, always foregrounding the technology rather than the incredibly deep skill and knowledge that historians and humanists have that we need so desperately. And so I think this is part of it's the neoliberal university climate we're working in.
Well, just to follow up on that last point, I think the conjunction of the digital and the humanities has really brought this tension of sorts to the fore, where it seems, and I think we're in a very unfortunate situation in which the digital seems to be kind of eclipsing or taking over the humanities. And what I think is really important to bring those two together, I think it's not the question of how can the humanities be fixed or saved by becoming digital, but really what are the questions that humanists bring to our thinking about technology. And every role that I've played at the university in terms of research and support has always been to try to put the humanists in the conversation with the scientists, with the folks in the medical, with folks with engineering, with folks with information studies. But as to say, we have to ask these questions that we're asking here today. The cultural, deep cultural, historical, social, economic questions inflected by race and gender, sexuality. And if we're not asking those questions all the time, then I think what we're actually risking replicating the very atomization that we spoke about earlier. So to me, I think any question around big data has to be a conversation that's, one, truly interdisciplinary, and really, again, foregrounding the fact that at its core, these are human constructs. That is, they're constructed by people, people who are fallible, and people who have histories and perspectives and agendas.
And where those sorts of deterministic systems are presenting and creating anti-human outcomes and anti-justice outcomes and anti-humanism in and of themselves. I mean, I just think it's important to, there's a lot of to and fro with this, but the internet was publicly funded, right? Node one of the internet right here. Who's reaping the spoils of the internet? Right here now, right? It's companies that are not paying any taxes. Amazon received a rebate last year. They didn't pay any taxes, right? So, and we all know about how Amazon treats its workers and the obsolescence of their workers per Sarah's research. I think that the digital humanities, is an interesting space that's emerging. I'm also troubled by how so much of it is built upon the idea of applying digital tools, as if those tools are not fraught with biases themselves, to humanistic work. I'm much more interested in the question of how do you humanize the digital world. I also am a little bothered or peeved by how the data sciences have blown up all over the place. I mean, what are the data sciences in terms of an intellectual form of inquiry? Right? I mean, what does that actually mean as a form of inquiry? Or is it just basically a neoliberal professional paradigm, right? So for me, just echoing what both my colleagues said, the more we can get people into the room together from different disciplines who think about the world in different ways that are guided by values of humanism and justice and equity, the more we can actually start to, think about technologies and data and so on as a byproduct of that. But I think the primacy has to be first and foremost what both of them just said.
There's nothing neoliberal about really expensive master's programs. I have more questions, but I'd like to open it up. People have comments or questions for the panel? In the back first.
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you everyone for a great panel. So we've been talking today a lot about and kind of pointing fingers at capitalism and private industry, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the role of the academy in this kind of paradigm, especially since we're at UCLA, sort of the birthplace of predictive policing, and then related but separately, what Safiya was kind of hinting at is sort of often feel that researchers who care are sort of relegated to this realm of making algorithms more inclusive, less biased, but in a way more digestible. And sort of always in the service of moving the machine forward. So I guess I'm wondering if you can speak to this sort of the role of the academy in sort of discovery and innovation and new knowledge and tech production.
I'll just say quickly that it's interesting to me to watch right now at a couple of, I'm going to piss some people off, I'm sorry in advance, not sorry, that they're, the epicenters of digital technological development, primarily Stanford and MIT, have recently launched these new ethics and AI, human-centered types of responses to the criticisms that have, again, quite frankly, come from the humanists and social scientists, and that, in the case of Stanford, no Black people were on their in their center leadership. The MIT initiative, both of which also Stanford and MIT $1 billion initiatives that I think are also about exactly what you said, which is humanizing, masking, obfuscating the kinds of conversations that we're having today. And you can see that just by the makeup of the people who were invited to participate. These are $1 billion initiatives, both of them. The MIT initiative launched on a $300 million gift from the person responsible, whose company is responsible for the decimation of affordable housing in the United States. So I think the academy is of course implicated because many of these epicenters in different Silicon corridors are university, corporate, or industry partnerships. I certainly am, happy that here at UCLA, Professor Roberts and I, Sarah Roberts and I, are starting a critical internet inquiry center here at UCLA. It's at a public school. It has no money yet, but the idea of, again, putting these kinds of critical centers on the map in public democratic institutions I find to be really important. And I think there are also responses that are happening in that way, not just by us and our colleagues here, many people who are here in the room who will be part of that, but also in other institutions. And so, these are the challenges that we're facing in the academy about kind of what will be supported. And it's easy to get, public relations money from people who are benefiting incredibly from these systems. And we see that happening certainly in the private university sector.
Josh, your question, first part was, what are the risks associated with AI? You asked about simulation and revolutionary aesthetics, possibilities of AI. A third question might be, what are the limits of AI? What are the things that we value that represent a zone that AI won't be able to go into? Because, frankly, there are things that we value that are not measurable, right? In some way, in some kind of, and therefore can't be subjected to an AI regime. And with the particular fear that because those things we value but can't be measured, they become devalued. We've seen repeatedly with certain kinds of labor and other places. So how do we give voice to articulating those values, identifying them, and then protecting them as another strategy for responding to ethics of AI?
This is far from any sort of complete engagement with that excellent question. But as part of my new book, which is called Beyond the Valley, I had an opportunity to look at kind of economic justice issues in relation to AI and automation, and interview a number of heads of large unions, labor unions here in the country. And one area that I received reassurance around, a form of labor that has always been debased in our country is caretaking work. And this is based on conversations I had with SEIU and Service Employees International Union. Try as they may, and this was happening at MIT when I was in grad school there. This robot caretaking thing is not taken off, and it's. I remember there was a lab at the MIT Media Lab specifically dedicated to that. So that's just a very, very small engagement with it. But I think it takes us back to the much larger question that preceded all this AI robotic, the recent wave of this, which is how compassionate forms of work that heal and aid society in a much, much deeper way than just extraction and making money and ever widening inequality are undervalued, yet in a strange, ironic sense, are valued with this incredible onset.
I think human and civil rights are a really important place we should be looking at in terms of already articulated values that we hold. Although they're not fully agreed upon globally, I think they're a starting point, and certainly we can deepen our commitments to human and civil rights. Those are places where AI should not continue to encroach where they are. You look at things like the United Nations Human Rights Commission, its food programs, distribution, for example, being directly tied to biometrics, that one cannot get food without being a data subject. And being subject to biometrics. So I think those are places where we must continue to raise red flags and say this is too far. And there are many examples in this way, but I think, I argue in my work that artificial intelligence will be a human and civil rights issue in this century. And I think we have to keep a really close focus. I mean, we see voter suppression, we see all kinds of ways in which rollbacks of civil rights in the US are happening around new emergent technologies, right? Or new emergent technologies are implicated in that, voting systems and other ways. So we have to study these things and we have to amplify our concerns.
This is a great question, Greg. It's another way of framing it is, what's the human, right? So what the limits of the AI also raise the question of what's profoundly and what still remains of our humanity, and is that not able to be put within or able to be translated into an AI? I mean, things that come to mind have to do with maybe erased histories, silenced histories. That's to say, and I don't believe that just by digitizing it all it's going to be there, but things that, voices that have been erased fundamentally, which is part of the history of humanity. So voices, fallibility, deep history, body-based knowledge, possibilities for healing and compassion, to use Ramesh's words. These might take us in the direction of things that perhaps don't fit within AI economy very comfortably, but could or should perhaps inform how we begin to think about that realm of ethics. And I go back to my original publication where I was thinking about agency, and it's really, again, it's that capacity not only to do something, but to decide whether one should do it. And to be able to ask that question constantly, the whether one should do it. That to me, I think, that raises, the foregrounds the ethical at every moment.
So just to close, I think we're out of time, right?
Almost.
Oh, we're almost. We have one. Oh, we can do more. I'm on the German block. All right. Do Germany. Okay. Yeah.
So one of the reasons why I find this discussion so fascinating is because I seem to sort of sense a double line between what you think, what you call the moral, and then what you call the ethical. And I'd like you to sort of elaborate on your understanding or your definition of the moral and the ethical. One way of sort of unraveling this question would be sort of going back to Hannah Arendt. The main reason why she thinks human rights are so problematic is because there is a normative, universalized conception of the human, which is oftentimes Eurocentric, and ahistorical, and that is then used as a norm, as sort of standard for everything, obviously under which a lot of oppressed people do not qualify. And so she goes back then to the notion of political rights, to the notion of citizenship, in order to emphasize how problematic the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are. So my question then is, do you really see now the need to think of the ethical versus the moral, precisely because the ethical is trying to push us into that humanist realm that is really abstract and far too universal, and we need to sort of go back to the ground and then emphasize the local, the citizenry of the digital? How do you sort of conceptualize the relationship between the ethical and the moral? I'd like to sort of get a better understanding of the conception of that relationship.
Well, I opened with talking about this narrow conception of ethics, which really are about kind of the individual, and yes, they are about the universal human, or a paradigm within which that exists, that doesn't exist, which you pointed out. And I think the moral questions are political questions. And one of the reasons that, again, we have to distinguish and really call forward morality in our conversations about AI and algorithms, because it completely radically transforms and centers values and whose values, and those become political questions. I think you can't avoid that. And those then are always tied to structure, social structure, right? What's the morality of our economy? What's the morality of our political systems? What's the morality of, who lives or dies by these technologies? And those become, again, I think that the politicizing of these conversations about AI and ethics, or AI and algorithms is really important. And so we should always link these back to, and I think many people who don't have the luxury of thinking about these technologies in these kind of ephemeral ways, philosophical ways around fairness and transparency. I mean, I don't feel the luxury of speaking about these technologies in that way. So I think of these as like, what are the moral structures that will foreclose opportunities, create opportunities, sustain oppression, or create opportunities for contradictions. It's morality that actually gives us the place to see the contradictions, and of course we know it's in the contradiction that most social movement organizing happens, right? And so these are the reasons why we need to keep those frameworks in the forefront so that we can do the organizing in response.
And I'll just say very quickly, morality allows one to extend themselves past the presumptions that are built into the term ethical, right? The term ethical often is for me, at least in the space of computer science and machine learning, it's often used as a band-aid by which the continuation of presumptions of users, right? That's the term we used, or that most use. It's sort of, how can I account for the experiences of users and try to be fair? But all of those forms of accounting are done by the heroic so-called designer or engineer, right? This engineering for society, which is actually a form of social engineering. Morality could be a term. It's a term that I appreciate a lot more, to move past those sorts of naive limitations, or perhaps even malicious ones, to actually really think about the 99.9% of people who are objectified largely by the systems we build.
I'll try to have a grand statement at all to say to this question, David. It's an important one. But I will say that I've given some thought to the tradition of relational ethics, particularly thinkers like Levinas and Buber, where there's a talk about responsibility to the other. Kind of comes from an existentialist tradition, and I wonder if algorithms can be ever thought of in a relational, ethical way. Can there be a kind of Levinasian algorithms, one that by definition couldn't be deployed in a one-directional or targeted way, but rather would be responsive to and in a kind of position of care with regard to community, a kind of a refuge of sorts. I mean, can a database be hospitable in a kind of Viridian sense? Can it offer asylum? Can it offer refuge? I mean, these questions could be really interesting if one rethought the kind of the instrumentalized functionality of an algorithm, which is often deployed in order to do X, right? We need to figure out where to police more. This is not a relational. It's not a kind of relationship with the community. This is a very instrumentalized way of targeting. Completely different modality in relational ethics.
Yeah, I mean, but the challenge here is the binary, right? And so that already overdetermines the logic of these systems.
So to close, because now we are closing. I do think it's really important to note and flag what should be obvious, perhaps the elephant in the room, but that this particular conversation, the conversations today, are happening, in the context and through the support of the Mann House, right? And are coming out of this, connected to this period where what we're talking about in many ways feels so right now and so contemporary, and yet it's almost been impossible to talk about the right now and the contemporary without going back historically, and specifically going back to this key period of displacement and exile and totalitarianism, where the human was used to dehumanize, where the technologies of being democratic and inclusive actually were the very tools of violence and genocide and destruction that, among other things, brought Mann to Los Angeles, in addition to so many other exilic thinkers, who, most of whom held on to the relational and the dialectic as a source of the beginning for new models of belonging that are more equitable and less violent. And I just think it's important that these historical conversations are happening at every turn in trying to unpack the complexities and potential problems, or non-potential, as we've heard, problems of the algorithm now. So I thank you all for your work. Thank everybody for being here today. Nikolai and the Mann House, Todd, for making this all